Thank you very much, and I'm glad you all joined this session. So let me just give a quick background on who I am, since I'm not really in Philly. I work for a public policy and advocacy organization in Pittsburgh called Pittsburgh Community Reinvestment Group. Most of my work is around transportation, focused mainly on mass transit and connection within communities. And I wanted to have this discussion largely because, I mean, given everything that's been going on for the past month, how transportation is funded is even more in chaos than it was before, right? I mean, in terms of revenues being way off and dramatically way off, we were talking earlier about how BART's ridership is down over 90%. And while on the one hand, there are things happening that people never thought could happen before, i.e. transit operating, for example, without necessarily collecting fares, you know, there still are jobs tied to this in terms of running systems, operating systems, maintaining systems, and the costs associated with that. And in an environment where it's entirely reliant on system consumption, more or less, I should say, what does that look like in the future? And, you know, coming back to Pennsylvania for a moment, so I work a lot on advocacy around the last transit funding crisis, the Act 44, Act 89 funding package in 2012 and 13. For those who are not from Pennsylvania, that was the package that filled a large gap in public transportation funding that was created by the previous transportation package falling apart. But in Pennsylvania also, we are very limited on how we can use, for example, liquid fuels revenue, which is on its own declining, and as you know, we electrify, goes away as well. So I guess, and I know it's probably early for this sort of discussion, but you know, more of a brainstorm maybe than anything else. What are people's thoughts about how we fund things going forward? And do we start getting to more of a means-tested way of doing that? It's always been interesting to me that, well, beyond interesting, I should say, frustrating, that, for example, highways don't really have the same hurdles to hit as mass transit does to receive money. And frankly, the same way, not the same hurdles to hit as even in the private sector with large capital asset construction and management. So just, I'll stop my caffeine-fueled rambling and just maybe say, you know, have people thought about this? If so, what are your thoughts?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Chris, for pulling this together. I'm Matt Popek. I'm with Montgomery County Planning Commission. I can speak for a brief moment about kind of the immediate term issues for transportation funding, and then I'm definitely very interested in hearing what the rest of the attendees pool has to say. Pennsylvania's legislature kind of already knew that they were facing multiple fronted transportation funding crises. Even before this started. The Pennsylvania Turnpike is something like $11 billion in debt, and that's only getting worse. They currently exist as a separate entity. I don't see how it's not inevitable that they eventually get pulled back under the state control, but they're in debt in part because they are the main source for transit funding, basically the backfill from the rest of the state. Our state police are generally funded out of these sorts of funding pots, which also drags down everything else and makes it kind of unavailable to do a lot of the stuff that needs to be done. For those of you from Pennsylvania and interested in this sort of thing, I will point you to a large swath of transportation-related bills currently making their way through the State House. In general, it's the House Bill 2060 series. There's actually 10 separate bills from 2060 to 2069 that have been actually proposed by the Republican legislature coming out of a transportation study that got wrapped late last year. They all each do something a little bit different. I can just read off the headlines very quickly. 2060 is about accelerating turnpike debt relief. 2061 is ending the diversion from the motor license fund for the state police. 2062 is about studying the benefits of asphalt versus concrete. 2063 would be expanding design-build activities. 2064 encourages county infrastructure banks. 2065 expands public-private partnerships. 2066 is for speeding tickets and otherwise to be allocated directly towards transportation safety projects. 2067 is a similar bill for steering Philadelphia casino revenues into transportation projects. 2068 is the interesting one from my end at Montgomery County, which is about allowing counties to propose additional funding sources or taxes to fill in transportation projects. And 2069 is consolidated permitting for groups of highway or large projects. So on the immediate side, there's at least a acknowledgement from across the political spectrum in Pennsylvania that something needs to be done. How exactly all of these bills are going to flow out is always a great question. Nobody knows exactly how Harrisburg works. Even Harrisburg doesn't usually know how Harrisburg works. But there's at least, they've been trying to do a lot of different things. I could argue that they're more on the margins. Broad scale tax increases I don't think have been proposed by anybody yet. Again, I think it's probably inevitable in the long run, but they've got a number of different solutions lined up for the immediate term. And I'm interested to add to that, or I don't know if I can answer much questions on that, but that's kind of what the Pennsylvania state legislature has been approaching with it so far.
That's a lot, Matt. Thank you. I lost track of all the bills for a moment there, so I'm glad you went right through them again. What about others on here? Are there any others who've had thoughts about this? I agree with Matt. A lot of this is really, some of it is welcome policy stuff, but in terms of like the big pot of cash, not so much, right?
There's a lot of places kind of off the beaten path that use kind of really interesting structures to fund things. So one place I visited, I bid on a job in Tulsa, Oklahoma last year. I didn't get it, but that's okay. I love them anyway. What's really interesting about Oklahoma is, as a super deep red state, they are really allergic to anything that looks like public spending or taxes. It's just a non-starter. So they developed this kind of parallel funding system for transportation and social services, it comes out of the world of philanthropy. So Tulsa was really interesting. And having ridden the bus in Tulsa, I can definitely confirm it is the worst bus system I've ever been on by far. It is horrendous. Jerome, I see you're on this particular call. Tulsa is so backwards when it comes to buses. It makes you guys in Indianapolis look like London. It is really just bad. And the reason I was there was that the mayor was pretty progressive and forward-looking, and he is looking to get people out of their cars. What's interesting about Tulsa is that there's no traffic. So the normal arguments to get people out of cars don't work. You can't say there's too much traffic and you waste time and all the other ways we get people to take a bus. Yes, it is a compliment, Jerome, absolutely. So what's really interesting, though, is that there's a really long-standing tradition of all these family foundations in Tulsa. A lot of it comes from oil money and some other businesses. And they plow a ton of money into kind of social good spending, including transportation. So, for example, there were no food halls in Tulsa until a couple of years ago, and there weren't really any independent bookstores. So what happened is the so-and-so family foundation bought a bunch of real estate. And so I was at this beautiful bookstore downtown, and I'm like, how do you guys stay in business in Tulsa? They're like, oh, we pay a nominal rent because the so-and-so family foundation owns the building. They just think there should be a bookstore here. So we pay almost nothing in rent, and the lease will never go away. They're never going to sell the building. They're never going to make us lose our lease. We can stay here forever. So food halls, businesses like that. And what they were looking to do is parlay some of that philanthropy money into transportation. So not necessarily just a direct subsidy to the transit entity, but really thinking more carefully about how can we get people out of the single-user car? And their frame was one I'd never seen anywhere else before, which was it's really expensive to own and maintain a car. And we have a lot of people under the poverty line here. How can we get them to do something else? We don't know what that something else is yet, but we're willing to spend some time, energy, and money into figuring out how to get them out of cars, because the less they spend on transportation, the more money they have on other stuff. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at the problem. And I'm wondering how many other cities out there where this could be an applicable question, to say, we have philanthropy in town, and they spend money on social services like hunger or housing. Can we get them to spend some of their money on transportation? And again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a subsidy to the transit agency. It could be something complementary. It could be something new we haven't thought of yet. But philanthropists are still going to have money in the current economic environment, right? State tax revenues are down. Sales taxes are down. Every kind of revenue you could possibly imagine is down. But if you're sitting on a huge pile of cash, who's sitting on a huge pile of cash right now? Really only two groups of people, bankers and philanthropists. Can we get them to invest in some of these things and give them something that looks like a rate of return? What was interesting about the people who were interested in funding the Tulsa stuff was that they were not looking for extraordinary rates of return. It was a do-gooder project for them. So you don't have to go in and promise them you're going to make huge, ridiculous profits on this. It's break-even or even less than break-even for them. But it's another way to steer their money. And the argument, I think, makes sense to a lot of us in this community, which is transportation is a basic thing where if you can't access jobs or you can't access shopping and you can't get to the supermarket, it doesn't matter if you get a subsidy for food, you don't have anywhere to spend it. So I'm just wondering if anyone's seen that in other places. I've only seen it in Oklahoma so far. It works really well in both Oklahoma City and Tulsa. I'm wondering if anyone thinks it can work in their cities.
Hey, this is Jerome from Indianapolis. I appreciate you bringing this up, David. I just wanted to comment that here in 2016, when we passed the transit referendum, some of the messaging that was really impactful for us was, it wasn't about reducing traffic congestion, because there is no traffic congestion in Indianapolis. But we really kind of drove home the messaging about access and access to opportunity, and how people you depend on transit. Even if you don't ride it, there are people, and the situation that we're in right now actually is demonstrating that very clearly, that people that are going to these essential jobs that are keeping some semblance of society from complete collapse are the ones that are riding transit. And so that was really important, and that got a lot of the business community, faith community, and some of the philanthropy community engaged in Indianapolis to really help us, push forward with this transit referendum and have it pass 60 to 40% here in a place that is also very adverse to taxes and increases and spending of any kind. But that seemed to be really effective of driving that point home about, who is this for and why is it important to you, even if you aren't going to ride transit?
There's a couple of small systems here. Granted, they get money, but it's not necessarily PennDOT funds. They're fixed route-ish. One is run by a Transportation Management Association. It covers this sprawling retail office complex out halfway between downtown and our airport, called Airport Transportation Corridor Association. It's act as shuttle. And they have a partnership with some of the businesses in those shopping centers, particularly IKEA. The other is in a very disinvested, institutionally disinvested old Milltown area, McKeesport, Duquesne, Glassport, those areas. Both of them have access to PWD funds as well as medical assistance funds. But a large chunk, especially of the one at the airport, is covered by the private sector. They have, I think, over 1 million rides a year now on a set of 3 different quasi-fixed route buses. But at the end of the day, most of what I've seen, at least, is still has some form of a public participation in the funding of this.
Yeah.
I saw Matthew in the comments put something down about this grant program. Do you care to elaborate more on that?
I remember when I was first getting into this field that the Job Access and Reverse Commute program was one of the items that was being used to try to fund, access for basically for, as we're now finding out, life-essential, life-sustaining businesses in order to get people out to various places. I think this got repealed back in 2007. It was a safety loo item back once upon a time, and there really hasn't been anything specifically like this. Everybody should know that the FAST Act for transportation funding expires in September. I don't think anybody has a firm idea yet as to whether, I think everybody has a guess as to whether Congress will be able to come up with a brand new transportation funding entire way of doing business by the end of September, or if we're going to be wandering into a period of continuing resolutions for a while. But there's plenty of programs that the feds could do. There's significantly less, but still probably a couple here and there that a state could do as they try to fill each of these needs that has been identified or perhaps exacerbated by our current crisis. So I don't know. It was just a thought in terms of we have attempted to solve this problem before. As with everything else, it comes and goes in cycles. We will end up seeing what the ultimate economic fallout and impact is from this pandemic time, and whether programs like this need to be reinstated or updated for the 2020s. I think the thing I'm curious about asking many of the participants on here, and I do not want to talk this entire time, of course, but how in your particular area, whether it's your industry, your sector, your geographic area, how much has transportation's funding crisis been on your radar already? Have you noticed any additional items about it recently, and how much do you think your area will be receptive to attempting to solve the problem as we're going forward? I mean, I work in transportation planning and am fully aware we have many more projects on the books as ideas that we have funding available to do them. Not just, massive highway expansion projects, but even just reconstruction of bridges and improving intersections and proposing additional transit services. Where have you been on that spectrum, and where do you see your particular subset and bubble going?
Okay, I'll jump in here. I'm Ken Grant. I work with AAA. I'm the Public and Government Affairs Manager for the state of Delaware. And so I've been focusing quite a bit on Delaware's transportation funding. Now, we've had a very strong lockbox set up for our Transportation Trust Fund, and we were enjoying quite a bit of the benefit of having the lowest gas prices within the Mid-Atlantic region, especially since New Jersey increased their gas tax a couple of years ago. We actually saw a $500 million increase just in the gas tax revenue annually because of that. And one of the things that we have been looking at before all of this was the upcoming change in more electric vehicles, more hybrid vehicles, so needing to shift to, we've done a couple of pilot programs with mileage-based user fees and that sort of thing, and looking at possibly implementing that at some point. But since March, they've said, look, tolls are down, gas taxes down, DMV fees way down, and went from a very robust, healthy transportation trust fund to now they're looking at easily a $60 million deficit by the end of the year. So there's a lot of scrambling to try to figure out what to do with that. The other aspect of all this is in looking at the advent of more autonomous vehicles, and I'm not talking about just the fully autonomous, I'm just talking about as we take further and further steps towards autonomy, we're going to find fewer and fewer funding sources through tickets, whether that's in a city for parking tickets or red light cameras or whatever. The technology is going to prevent drivers, or at least give drivers a little bit more of an advantage to avoid those kind of issues. So, and I can very easily see us, AAA has done a study in major cities across the country. We're looking at, over the past 10 years, a 30% reduction in income based on fees and fines and traffic tickets. That could very easily drop to zero within the next few years, depending on how fast the technology takes over. So, yeah, there's a lot to consider here.
Speaking from the New York City region, my name is William Wong. I work for the Port Authority. We operate we operate 4 lines. So we operate the airports, we operate the tunnels and bridges, and of course paths, as well as port. But more speaking on the tunnels and bridges and path system, because we operate all these different ones, I think it does vary from time to time. But overall, everything has dropped in revenue, but we gain our revenue from volume. And obviously, I think because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that is not going to recover, bounce back right away over the next few months. But certainly we do anticipate a recovery over time. And as the area urbanizes, the volume we believe will certainly increase as well. And so from New York City's perspective, even if they don't implement the congestion tax, which will also provide revenue for the city, eventually that's going to become more commonplace for it, and that will enable us to generate additional revenue. Another key aspect of this is also value capture. A lot of countries outside of America have implemented value capture policies within regional land, et cetera, that have proven wildly successful. Japan's transportation companies are actually just real estate companies that build subways to their properties. And so that is a really interesting policy. The culture isn't necessarily set here yet in the United States, but I believe that's something a lot more commonplace for people in transportation now, new people entering transportation, as that's a really sensible policy. Why don't we start looking at that? And so once we change that narrative, I think that can be a really effective funding vehicle for a lot of transportation organizations.
That's actually interesting, because wasn't it originally that way with the streetcar companies, particularly in the United States?
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the only problem with value capture, and I think it's also a wonderful idea, it works well with new construction and particularly new rail. What's more challenging is how you would retrofit that for existing. But yes, I've been to that part of the world, and it's phenomenal. But they basically copied it from North America because we did it first and then we dropped it.
That was antitrust issues, wasn't it?
No, I think what happened generally is it was in part, yes, it was in part that, because for a long time utilities were allowed to own transit companies, and it worked very well because utilities would run a surplus, and that particular thing was outlawed by antitrust, so that's absolutely correct. But I think what happened is the advent of the automobile and these so-called streetcar real estate companies were considered horrible monopolies, and so the governments taxed them to the point that they just not only weren't profitable, they were going out of business with the auto competition. That's, put it very briefly, what happened. in the U.S. But it's still a very good idea, and if we're ever to get any new construction done, it's absolutely the way to go. In New York, they did it to some extent with the number 7 subway line extension to Hudson Yards. They could have done more, but at least they tried.
That's also the Silver Line to Dulles, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, there's two things going on the Silver Line. One is that kind of the newer construction heading up into Loudoun County assumes transit-oriented development immediately around the stations, but also within Tyson's Corners, the official county plan going forward is that they could convert what essentially started as an exurb with a giant mall into an actual walkable downtown. So it's at the very early stages of that where new construction is being oriented towards a grid based around the 2 or 3 Silver Line stations that serve at the quote-unquote downtown area. But 100 years from now, the theory is that it will be just as walkable as Crystal City.
Yeah, Pennsylvania has versions of that. They're called TRIDs, or I think it's Transit Reinvestment Districts, where basically to get around the fact that, SEPTA or Port Authority in Pittsburgh can't be full-blown real estate developers, they've tried to implement various tax increment financing schemes to at least take advantage of some of the benefits of value capture. But I don't think TRID has actually successfully been used, at least on a broad enough scale, anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania yet. That legislation's been on the books for a while, at least 10 years, I think, but it hasn't gotten off the ground. The initial conditions haven't been set up anywhere for it to actually work. I would love to see, our transit agencies be more like Japan Railways or MTR in Hong Kong, anywhere that is able to actually leverage the fact that they're sitting on what becomes extremely valuable areas of land because of the fact that there's transit accessibility there. But we have not cracked that code or re-cracked that code yet.
Since Jerome Horn is on in the group at some point, I'd like to know how the Indianapolis area was successful in getting their funding, since they're definitely within a very red state, and they may be a model of what other metro areas may have to do in the future.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit of insight, and I'll try to paste some links in the chat to. There's been a few podcasts that have covered this conversation really well. But to your point, we're in a very red state, and we're the state capital of Indiana. It is, the fact that we passed the transit referendum by 60% was pretty phenomenal here. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we did a lot of kind of education and outreach with our elected officials in the city level, but we also had some good advocates at the state level as well. And we had a lot of good partnerships that were formed between philanthropy and the business community. And one of the biggest things in Indianapolis is there's a lot of conversation about the access to opportunity. And for businesses, one of the things that Indy, kind of identified in a strategic plan was that the city of Indianapolis, in order to be competitive with some of the other cities that we like to think we're on par with, we have to make the investment in transit. It's such an auto-centric, focused place. And so we really kind of came from many different angles, whether it was the access angle, the economic development angle. We kind of tried different messaging. We had a lot of good people that worked on
I think he froze.
Yeah.
Select a message that would resonate with a particular group was really helpful.
So we're talking about private participation in transit, and TRID. Yeah, I've been involved in a couple TRID things in different degrees. I guess on going, and I know this isn't necessarily a pro-highway crowd, but to me, cracking that nut and how that money gets spent has a lot to do with transit success, right? And we kind of, you know, in the world I watch, at least here in Western PA, it's more or less if the money is available, you check all the boxes with the feds in the state, you get the money to build the road. Or to fix the road that is completely obsolete to what it was originally built for, not some sort of long-term asset management strategy. And even before this, there was discussions. I think even the governor of Iowa at one point said the highway system needs to shrink, and that was like national news, right? Do other countries in the world have such a freewheeling access to highway and road funding the way we do here in the U.S., or is it more means tested? Is that why public-private partnerships on highways seem to work more for, Europe or Australia or things like that? Is that a way to get more multimodal by putting those sorts of, I'll say, market-driven challenges on roads themselves?
So in terms of funding, like on the highway aspect of it, the way way American states and localities fund their transportation is obviously on the gas tax. And that of itself will eventually, once we go full electric, have no impact. And also privately, right, innovations in car has made fuel efficiency much greater. So naturally that is going down along with inflation, like we're not adjusting gas tax. Other countries, especially Europe, they use tolls or, VAT tax, right, vehicle miles traveled, to kind of as a way of capturing the, use of the road and the cost. So that actually, no matter the innovation, no matter how efficient your fuel is, you're still traveling the same amount of road. And so you should be taxed based on the road that you use and worn up, right? And so that's definitely been a difference in policies on our end. And then because the gas tax is not getting raised because of the political pressure, or it's not getting adjusted, especially to inflation, that's the big funding issue for, of course, our infrastructure system.
Right.
Chris, I hope that Pittsburgh is actually doing that well with all their stuff, from the southeastern Pennsylvania region, and we work closely with TVRPC, our regional MPO, to handle the region's transportation improvement program. There's still projects, we are working off of the backlog of projects that were initially planned 20 to 25 years ago. There's a number that are just getting out the door now. In terms of adding new types of projects, whether it is expansions or, as I was saying earlier, or even just reconstructions and rebuilding of places. We've had 4 tip update cycles, I guess, that I've been involved with one way or another, and only one of them had projects that allowed us to add new things to our list of things to do in the region. And even then it was, I think, 2 out of the 6 that Montgomery County wanted to add, and all of ours were either, bridge reconstructions, intersection upgrades and improvements, nothing of any sort of dramatic capacity improvements. So we are definitely feeling a funding pinch. It's only going to get worse as people above the regional level decide that more money needs to be put into interstate rebuilding and reconstruction pieces. We do what we can in terms of sending money over to SEPTA through a transit flex, but ultimately, if that needs to get addressed, it's probably going to be through federal legislation, not anything that anybody on this call is going to be able to take a swing at.
But things are not removed from the tip, right? They're just additionals are put on. Like projects go on a tip and then they don't die in a lot of cases.
For the most part, they can kind of die just by lack of attention paid to them. There aren't a lot of things I'd say at this point that would really be at least, you can feel free to look at the DVRPC's tip. I know the draft for that is going to get published for our upcoming one pretty shortly here, but it's hard to say that there's really a lot of projects that deserve to go away at this point in terms of what Philadelphia is trying to do. We have not built any new highways in quite a while. We also haven't built new transit in quite a while, but that's neither here nor there.
I think one of the strategies that has generally worked either at the local and state level, beside what Jerome was talking about earlier, is I think when you approach, it has to be approached comprehensively, like something for everyone. It can't be just a transit-only plan. It can't just be a highway-only plan, but there has to be something in it for everyone. It often goes with state bonding programs, which happened in New York. I think the last one that was successful has been a long time ago. It was 15 years ago. But if you can set something out where there is both highway and transit investment, that might have a better shot of, even if it's taxes or if it's bonding, it has a better shot of going through if there's something for the rural areas, suburban areas, as well as the urban areas.
I'm going to read one of the questions in the chat if those have not seen it. Darwin, sorry, your last name is kind of cut off there, Darwin. Has not related to value capture. How can value capture address equity issues such as transit deserts, and can it be done avoiding displacing people from driving up rent and land prices? David responded, value capture doesn't just have to piggyback on real estate values. Oh, step down here for a minute. We're looking at underused/unused assets to see if there is anyone who will pay to use them as something that can be done.
Yeah, I think the assumption is that the model is that JR model, where you come in and you develop new condos, and that displaces the existing people, and then you get to charge whatever the value added is from the condos. But I think there's a lot more going on in American cities than that. I think infill, and especially in the last 20 years, has become much more important than kind of the pushing out type of development we saw in the 60s and 70s. I think people are a lot less interested in these days in drive until you qualify and much more interested in returning to the core city. And so you've got, the idea of value capture from, are there existing assets you already have that maybe you closed off or don't run anymore? Is there a closed station you've already built that you can reopen without too much disruption to the existing neighborhood? Can you piggyback more services into the station you've already built? New York's trying to do that with New Penn Station, right? Like, okay, we have a giant post office there. We don't need a giant post office anymore. What we'll do is we'll turn it into shops and retail. Who is Penn Station displacing from West Midtown? Nobody. It's kind of looking outside that traditional model of gentrification where, okay, we're going to move into the rundown neighborhood and we'll put in a shiny new station, busway, whatever, for the new transplants and get rid of all the old people. Politically, that's a heavier lift than we'll just add more to downtown.
Yeah.
Or, my favorite, sports stadiums. It's really hard these days. It's very unusual, unless you live in Atlanta, to build a new sports stadium without adding some transit capacity. And that goes for example, I have a client I work with who develops underutilized properties in St. Louis. And his thing is affordable housing. So we've expanded that to also include affordable retail. So the idea is you build housing for your nurses, for your postmen, and so on, and then you make sure they have like an Aldi or a Trader Joe's to shop at. You're not trying to max that out. So what you can do is construct it for future transit. You make sure you put bus bulbs in. You make sure you put a drop-off station for Ubers. You make it hard to own a car and live in the new property, and you put in some bike infrastructure, for example. That's all forms of, value added, where you're not displacing anyone, because his whole gimmick is he gets properties for free or very low cost because nobody lives there right now. There's huge swaths of St. Louis City that are just empty, right? Like there's places in Buffalo that are just empty. The city of Detroit, the cities have shrunk tremendously. It's better to go where places where you're just extending a little bit of your infrastructure. You're not really displacing that many people, or the people you're displacing are minimized, but you've already got something that you had in the 19th century or early 20th century. You're just reconstructing, and you can adapt for coming 21st century technologies. Changing parking minimums is going to have a huge impact on your value capture proposition, because all of a sudden lots of people want to live in the inner city and not own cars anymore. That's just a market preference.
Right.
We capitalize on that rather than trying to force people out of doing something they don't want to do. I'm always about the path of least resistance for people. If you can get someone to do what they're doing anyway, but all of a sudden you can tax them for it or encourage them to do it slightly better for you, do that first. Go for your easiest lifts and worry about the heavy lifts later. So I think there's a lot of evidence out there that, especially last 15, 20 years, there's been a tremendous amount of development in value capture, where it's not just about, hey, I'll stack a condo on top of it, or hey, I'll put I had a friend when she lived in San Diego who lived in an apartment complex in a mall parking lot. There was housing in the mall parking lot. Nobody really wants to live in a mall parking lot. It's for grad students. Or other folks who don't have a tremendous amount of options at their income level. No offense to any grad students on the chat. But there's ways to think about transit as not just, hey, I got to run a rail through here, but do you make it easy for carpooling? Do you make it easy for buses? Do you make it easy for vans? Do you make it easy even for paratransit? And that can all be done through your existing real estate rules and all the different things that are required in your community. We'll see what happens after the pandemic, whether real estate recovers quickly or slowly, but there's definitely been a movement. I grew up in New York City in Queens, and the Queens of 1990 is quite different than the Queens of 2020. It's radically different, and that is because of the vast movement of people who want to live in the city. So if they want to live in the city, let's give them some enhancements to live in the city. They want to do it anyway. Let's just make it better for them.
Yeah.
One thing, sorry folks, I just want to jump in here and remind everyone that this session is going to be ending in 1 minute at 2:05, so if you want to start wrapping up, that might be good to do. At 2:15, so we have 10 minutes in between these sessions, we're going to have 4 sessions. There's going to be, in this room, me actually, for my railroad operations crashless course on how a railroad actually operates, a favorite at 3 prior transportation camps. In the WTS room, we have COVID-19 and transportation in low equity, COVID-19 and transportation equity in low-income neighborhoods. In the Xavier room, we have Story Time, a single Greyhound from New York to LA relived. And then we have Transportation and Community Wealth in the Evans room. So, thanks, guys.
Great.
I leave it back to you to wrap up.
Any parting thoughts from anyone? Thank you, Jeff. All right. Well, thank you all. I'm curious, Jeff. Is it possible to capture the chat dialogue and put that out somewhere?
Sorry, the chat dialogue?
Yeah. So we had a number of things that were thrown in our chat box here. Is it possible to trap that?
Not. That's my biggest gripe with the platform, is that it does not save the chat. But what you can do is, if someone has the app open, is just highlight it and copy it. And if you copy it and email it to TransportationCamp PHL at gmail.com or any of these rooms at jefftest.com, I can take it and I can send it to everyone who was in this, because it copies all the emails from the attendee list. So I can email that out to everyone who attended if you'd like.
Got it. Okay, great.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.